Imagine waking up, thinking it's just another day. You go about your routine, unaware that by nightfall, your heart will stop and you will experience something beyond belief. What happens when you die? Is it the end, or is it the beginning of something we can't even imagine? This is the story of a man who died, left his body, and saw what waits on the other side. His journey will leave you questioning everything you think you know about life, death, and what lies beyond. John was the kind of man people admired for his dedication and simplicity. He lived in a small suburban neighborhood, balancing work and family like most people. His life revolved around his job as a counselor for troubled teens, a role he loved deeply. He often said, "If I can help even one kid turn their life around, it's worth it." John had no idea how those words would one day come back to him in a way he could never have expected. Life wasn't without its challenges, but John approached every day with optimism. His morning routine was always the same: a cup of coffee, a quick prayer, and a drive to the youth center where he worked. The kids he helped weren't easy to deal with, but he believed in them. After work, John would return home to his wife and 2 children. They were his pride and joy. Though his days were busy, he always made time for family dinners and bedtime stories. To the outside world, John's life might have seemed ordinary, but to him, it was fulfilling. One evening, as John sat on the couch, a sharp pain hit his side. He winced, thinking it was just a muscle spasm. But the pain didn't go away. Over the next few hours, it became unbearable. His wife urged him to see a doctor, but John waved it off. "It's probably nothing," he said, trying to sound reassuring. By the next morning, the pain had intensified, and John could no longer ignore it. Little did he know, this pain was the beginning of an extraordinary journey that would forever change his life. By mid-morning, John's condition had worsened. The pain in his side felt like a hot blade twisting deeper with every breath. His face was pale, and beads of sweat dripped down his forehead. Finally, he admitted to his wife, "I can't take this anymore. Let's go to the hospital." At the emergency room, John tried to remain calm. "It's just a kidney stone," he told the nurse as he was wheeled into an examination room. The medical staff quickly ran tests, and their initial diagnosis seemed to confirm John's assumption: a kidney stone. "We've seen this before," the doctor assured him. "We'll manage the pain and take care of it." John was given painkillers and antibiotics. For a brief moment, he felt relief, but something wasn't right. As the hours passed, his condition didn't improve. Instead, it worsened. His temperature spiked, and he began to shiver uncontrollably. The doctor returned with a grave expression. "You have an infection, and it's spreading. We need to act quickly." John was admitted for surgery to remove the kidney stone. The procedure itself went smoothly, but the infection was stronger than expected. Despite the antibiotics, it had already begun to invade his bloodstream. By the evening, John's organs started to show signs of failure. His heart rate plummeted, his breathing became shallow, and monitors around him began to sound alarms. Nurses rushed to his side, and doctors were called in. His wife stood helplessly in the corner of the room, her hands clasped in silent prayer. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the unthinkable happened. The machines flatlined, and John's body fell still. To the doctors, it was a moment of defeat, but for John, it was the beginning of something far beyond the understanding of this world. John's last memory in the hospital was a blur of faces and voices. He could hear the frantic shouts of the medical team, the beeping of monitors, and his wife's faint sobs. Then, silence. Suddenly, John was no longer in the hospital room. He felt weightless, as though he were floating. Looking down, he saw his own body lying on the bed, surrounded by nurses and doctors. The scene was surreal. He could see their desperate attempts to revive him, but he felt oddly detached. "I'm dead," he thought, but there was no fear, no panic. Instead, a profound sense of peace enveloped him. In an instant, John felt himself being drawn upwards. It wasn't like flying, it was more like being carried by an invisible force. He passed through the ceiling of the hospital, through the building itself, and into the open sky. The speed was unimaginable, faster than anything he could describe. Yet, it was gentle and effortless. A brilliant light appeared in the distance, growing brighter and closer with every passing moment. It wasn't blinding, it was warm and inviting. The light seemed alive, as though it were calling to him. As John moved closer, he noticed something remarkable. The space around him was filled with vibrant colors, colors he had never seen before. The hues seemed to pulse with energy, radiating a sense of joy and harmony. Ahead, the light transformed into what looked like a doorway, but it wasn't made of wood or metal. It was as if the very fabric of the universe had parted to create an entry point. John felt an overwhelming pull to step through, but just before he crossed the threshold, he paused. He felt as though he were being watched. Turning slightly, he saw vague forms in the distance, shadows of people or beings he couldn't yet make out. The doorway beckoned him, and as he stepped through, his entire being was filled with a sensation so profound it was beyond words. Peace, love, and belonging washed over him in waves. John had crossed over, but the journey had only just begun. As John stepped through the doorway, his senses were overwhelmed. He was in a place that defied explanation. Beautiful, vibrant, and alive in ways he had never experienced before. The air itself seemed to hum with a soft, melodic energy, as if the entire world was singing. He looked around and realized the light wasn't just coming from above. It radiated from everything around him. The trees glowed with an inner brilliance, their leaves shimmering in hues of green and gold that seemed alive. Flowers of every imaginable color dotted the ground, their petals moving gently, though there was no wind. Even the grass beneath his feet felt alive, soft yet sturdy, as though it were welcoming him. There was no sun, yet everything was perfectly illuminated. The light seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was warm, but not in the way the sun feels on Earth. It was comforting, like a gentle embrace. John took a step forward and felt an unfamiliar sensation, pure peace. There was no pain, no fear, no anxiety. It was as if every burden he had carried in life had been lifted. He felt whole for the first time. Ahead, a crystal-clear river sparkled, its waters flowing with a rhythm that seemed almost musical. He knelt down and touched it. The water was cool and refreshing, yet it didn't leave his hands wet. As he brought his fingers to his lips, he felt a surge of energy and life course through him, unlike anything he had ever known. But it wasn't just the beauty of the place that captivated him. John noticed something extraordinary about everything he saw. It all seemed aware. The trees, the flowers, even the river seemed to acknowledge his presence, as though they were happy he was there. "I've never belonged anywhere like I belong here," John thought to himself. As he stood, he noticed movement in the distance. Figures began to appear, walking toward him. They were glowing, radiant, and full of joy. Though their features were unfamiliar, John felt a deep connection to them, as though they had known each other for eternity. Before he could fully process what was happening, a thought entered his mind, clear and unmistakable. This is not just a place. This is the beginning of something greater. John felt a presence approaching, more powerful than anything he had yet experienced. Though he couldn't see it, he knew it was coming closer. His heart raced, not with fear, but with anticipation. Who am I about to meet? He wondered. The presence grew stronger with every passing moment, filling John with a mixture of awe and wonder. It wasn't just a feeling, it was as if the very air around him was alive, humming with power and love. Then he saw him. In the distance, a figure appeared, walking toward John with purpose. He couldn't quite make out the face at first, but the figure radiated a light so brilliant yet so gentle it was almost impossible to look away. John felt his knees weaken. Without thinking, he dropped to the ground, overwhelmed by the sheer majesty of the presence before him. As the figure came closer, John began to see more clearly. He recognized the scars on his hands and feet, marks that told a story more powerful than words ever could. It was him, Jesus. John's heart swelled with emotion. He couldn't speak, couldn't move, but tears streamed down his face. All he could do was bow his head and whisper, "Thank you." Jesus stopped in front of him and gently knelt down. His eyes met John's, and in that moment, John felt a love so profound it broke every barrier within him. It was a love that saw everything he had ever done, every mistake, every failure, and yet embraced him fully without hesitation. "You're here," John managed to say, his voice trembling. Jesus smiled, and it wasn't just a smile. It was the kind of smile that reached into the depths of John's soul. Without speaking, Jesus placed a hand on John's shoulder. The touch was light, yet it sent waves of peace through his entire being. In that instant, John felt as though a flood of knowledge was being poured into him. He understood things he had never grasped before. The depth of God's love, the purpose of life, and the interconnectedness of everything in creation. It wasn't a conversation in the traditional sense. Jesus didn't use words. Instead, John simply knew. He understood in his heart and mind all at once, as if the truths were being written directly onto his soul. John wanted to stay in that moment forever, basking in the presence of perfect love. But then Jesus spoke, his voice calm yet filled with authority. "You have to go back." The words pierced through John's joy. He shook his head, tears flowing freely now. "No," he pleaded. "Please don't send me back. I belong here. I've never felt so complete." Jesus looked at him with compassion, understanding his reluctance. "You have a purpose, John. There are people who need to hear what you've seen. They need to know." John was silent, his heart breaking at the thought of leaving this place. But he couldn't deny the truth in Jesus' words. "Will you go?" Jesus asked, his eyes searching John's face. John hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I'll go." Jesus smiled again, and in that moment, John felt a surge of strength and peace. Though he didn't want to leave, he knew deep down that this wasn't goodbye, it was just the beginning. As Jesus stood and turned, John whispered, "Thank you." Jesus looked back, his gaze full of love. Then everything around John began to fade, and he felt himself being pulled away from the radiant light. He was going back. As John felt himself being drawn back, the vivid beauty of the world around him began to blur. But even as the physical details faded, the truths he had experienced remained clear and alive within him. It was as if his entire being had absorbed a treasure of knowledge, and he was carrying it back with him. John described the sensation as a download of understanding. He didn't hear the lessons spoken aloud. They were simply there, imprinted in his mind and heart. The first revelation was about love. John had always believed in love, but what he experienced in that place was beyond comprehension. He now understood that love was not just an emotion or a virtue, it was the very essence of existence. It was the force that connected everything, the thread that held creation together. God's love is infinite, John thought. It's not limited by time, space, or our own understanding. It's deeper than anything we could imagine, and it's for everyone. The second insight was about purpose. John realized that every moment of life mattered. Even the smallest acts of kindness and the simplest choices had eternal significance. He saw how lives were interconnected, how one person's actions could ripple out to touch countless others in ways they might never realize. John also understood something about pain and suffering. While he didn't experience any in that realm, he was given clarity about its purpose on earth. He saw that even in the darkest moments, there was a greater plan at work. Suffering wasn't meaningless. It was often a pathway to growth, empathy, and deeper understanding. Another truth struck him deeply. Life on earth was a temporary assignment. He now saw the world as a preparation ground, a place where people could grow closer to God and fulfill their unique missions. But the most profound insight was about grace. John had always believed in forgiveness, but in this place, he truly understood it. He saw that God's grace wasn't something people had to earn. It was a gift, freely given to all who would accept it. As these revelations filled him, John felt a new sense of urgency. He understood why Jesus had sent him back. People need to know this, he thought. They need to understand how much they are loved, how much their lives matter. Before he could dwell further, the pull back to his earthly body grew stronger. The light around him dimmed, and the vivid colors of the heavenly realm faded. John felt a momentary pang of loss, but he also carried with him the unshakable peace of knowing what awaited him beyond this life. Then, with a jolt, he was back. When John returned to his body, he was immediately struck by how heavy and limited it felt. The vibrant light, the peace, and the warmth of the other realm were gone, replaced by the sterile, cold environment of the hospital. His chest ached, and every breath felt like a struggle. Yet, he was alive, and the memory of his encounter burned brightly in his mind. The medical staff was in shock. One of the doctors had already been preparing to sign his death certificate. Now, monitors beeped steadily as John's heart pumped life through his veins once more. Nurses scrambled to stabilize him, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. John's wife rushed into the room, tears streaming down her face. "You're back," she cried, gripping his hand tightly. He wanted to tell her everything, but he could barely speak. His body was weak, and his voice was barely a whisper. As the days passed, John slowly regained his strength. Each moment was filled with a deep sense of gratitude, but he also felt an urgent responsibility. He couldn't shake Jesus' words. "You have a purpose. There are people who need to hear what you've seen." Lying in his hospital bed, John began to reflect on how he could fulfill this mission. He wasn't a preacher or a theologian. He was just an ordinary man, but he realized that his story wasn't about him. It was about the love, grace, and hope he had encountered. I don't have to be perfect, he thought. I just have to share what I've experienced. As his recovery continued, John began to share bits of his experience with the hospital staff. The nurses were captivated by his descriptions of the vibrant colors, the overwhelming love, and his encounter with Jesus. One nurse, visibly moved, said, "I've never heard anything like this. You've given me so much hope." John realized that the mission wasn't about grand gestures or public speaking. It was about reaching people one by one, sharing the truth that had been revealed to him. Still, there was a part of him that felt unworthy. Why me? He often wondered. Why was I allowed to see this when so many others haven't? But the answer always came back to the same thing. It's not about you. It's about the message. As John prepared to leave the hospital, he promised himself that he would honor the mission given to him. He didn't know where the journey would take him, but he knew one thing for certain. He would share his story with anyone willing to listen. The moment John left the hospital, he was struck by how different everything felt. The world seemed brighter, but not in the way he remembered. The colors of the trees, the sky, and even the pavement seemed muted compared to the vivid hues he had seen in the other realm. Yet, John was grateful to be alive and determined to carry out his mission. His return home was emotional. His wife and children embraced him tightly, tears streaming down their faces. "We thought we lost you," his wife said, her voice trembling. John held her close, silently thanking God for giving him more time with his family. Over the next few weeks, John faced a long recovery. His body was weak, and every step felt like an uphill climb. But his spirit was stronger than ever. He carried with him the memory of the love and peace he had experienced, and it gave him the strength to push forward. Friends and neighbors came by to check on him, each one curious about what had happened. At first, John hesitated to share his story. He wasn't sure if people would believe him or if they would think he was imagining things. But then he remembered the command he had been given. Share what you've seen. The first time he told his story, it was to a close friend who had come to visit. John described the pain, the moment he left his body, and the beauty of the place he had visited. He spoke about meeting Jesus and the overwhelming love he had felt. By the time he finished, his friend was in tears. "That's incredible," his friend said. "I've always wondered what happens after we die. Hearing this gives me so much hope." As word spread, more people began to reach out to John, asking him to share his experience. He started small, speaking to groups at his church and local community centers. Each time, he felt the same nervousness, but he also felt a sense of peace as he spoke. John's story wasn't just about what he had seen, it was about the truths he had learned. He talked about the importance of love, the purpose of life, and the reality of eternity. People listened intently, many of them moved to tears by his words. For John, this was more than just a story. It was a mission, a way to bring light and hope to others. And with each person he spoke to, he felt a small piece of heaven shining through. Life after John's near-death experience was anything but ordinary. The world around him remained the same, but John was not. He saw life through a new lens, one sharpened by the clarity of eternity. Everything seemed more significant. Every interaction, every choice, every moment.